Welcome to Digital Marketing Domination, the go-to podcast for digital marketers. Each week, we dive into proven digital marketing tactics, cutting-edge tools, and real-world case studies that help you dominate your market. This is your playbook for digital success.
Welcome to another Digital Marketing Domination episode. Today, we're excited to have Jeanne Jennings on the show. Jeanne has been helping companies make their email marketing more effective, profitable for over 20 years, focusing on strategy, testings, and results that actually matter. She is here to share practical tips, real client stories, and how she uses AI to get more out of email campaign. Let's dive in. Thanks for coming on the show, Jeanne.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jamil.
All right. So for our listeners, talk to us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So it's kind of fun. I kind of grew up with the World Wide Web because I went to work for CompuServe right out of school. And back then, really no one knew what the internet was, if you can imagine that time. So it's been really fun to kind of see it grow and become, just a part of everyday life. So that's been really great. In 2000 is when I actually started focusing specifically on email. I kind of fell into it, but I found that I really loved it and I loved the focus. And there were so many people that were leaving money on the table with their email marketing campaigns that it just made sense to focus on that when I went into consulting.
So in terms of getting into email, is it more your focus on the B2B side or is it more B2C?
Yes, I do all of the above.
Okay.
As well as I live in Washington, D.C., so there's a lot of B2G, business to government. So there's a lot of different variations on it. The nice part is that the email marketing kind of strategies and tactics and things don't change. And I'm a pretty quick study when it comes to industries. So I'm tell people it's much easier for me to get up to date on your industry than it is for you to learn everything you need to know about email marketing. So yeah, I do all of the above. And I work with big companies like Verizon, Hasbro, PayPal, but I also work with startups and I work with smaller companies. So it's really fun. Each has their own challenges.
Email is probably the cheapest form of advertising that you can do that gets the best ROI. But I think a lot of businesses struggle in measuring that ROI. So what are the metrics that a business should look at to say, hey, that was an email campaign that performed well versus one that didn't do as well?
Yeah, it's kind of a double-edged sword. Email is very affordable. And that's a positive. It's not hard to create a profitable email campaign. But a lot of companies leave money on the table because they don't understand that if they invest a little bit more, they'll be able to get a super profitable campaign. I think one of the big issues there is exactly what you touched on, which is the idea of metrics. So opens and clicks, those are diagnostic metrics. They're helpful as levers to understand what you need to move to actually make the important metrics, which would be conversion rate of some kind or a revenue-based metric, move, because that's really what's going to keep the lights on for your business. Are you a hockey fan at all?
Not really.
I'm in Washington, D.C., but
Okay.
I grew up outside of Philadelphia, so I grew up a Flyers fan, but now I'm all in on the Capitals. But there's an interesting thing in hockey. So there's something called the President's Trophy. And at the end of the regular season, the team that has the very best record wins the President's Trophy. Now, logically, if you think about it, you think, well, they're probably a shoo-in to win the Stanley Cup, which is what really matters. Only 21% of the time does the President's Trophy winner win the Stanley Cup.
Wow.
And that's something that I learned the hard way because my Capitals kept winning the President's Trophy and then didn't win the Stanley Cup for many years. But they finally did. We've got one win. So email marketing is very much the same way. I actually, a few years ago, went back over all the testing I'd done over the course of my career. And I looked at the A/B split tests and I looked at which ones, where the highest click-through rate also had the highest conversion rate or revenue metric that we were working on. 7% of the time, the highest click-through rate aligned with the highest conversion rate or the highest revenue metric. So that's the kind of stuff you need to be careful of. That's the reason you need to look at those business metrics. One of those tests, very interesting, was a client that sold like high-end audio equipment for music. We had an email test that they did where one email had the pricing of their products and the other didn't have the pricing. And the email without the pricing got a much higher click-through rate. but the one that had the pricing in it, we had a much higher revenue per email because those people were just curious about what the price was. When it was out of their league, they walked away. When we put the pricing in, we actually narrowed the number of people who clicked, but they were serious buyers. They knew they could afford it before they even clicked through. So that's why those conversion and revenue metrics are so incredibly important. And that's why opens and clicks are just not a good, they're not a good KPI.
So it's obvious that if you show pricing versus not show pricing, not showing pricing is going to get more clicks. So your conversion rate's going to be a lot lower, but total conversions, when you split tested it, which one outperformed the other?
When we look at conversions, we look at conversions from the number of sent, not the number of clicks.
Okay.
So that evens the playing field there.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't like, when I was working with Verizon, they were doing conversions based on the number of clicks. And it's not a good way to do conversions. It really kind of skews everything. And really, when you're doing your budgeting, let's say you know you have a number you need to hit this month. If you are doing your conversion rate out of your send quantities, then you know exactly how many you need to send. So that's really the key. And that's important to do apples to apples metrics. So when you go out a send rate, not conversions, that gives you that apples to apples level playing field.
So let's talk a little bit about testing initiatives. A lot of clients will sometimes never test, and then some will over test in some areas, and then you don't have a big enough sample set. So how can testing kind of improve email results, and what are some tips and tricks that you have for some of the listeners?
Yeah, so testing is really important. You want to use scientific method, which means you come up with a hypothesis. You have an idea of why what you're testing should improve performance. It's not just pulling it out of the air. The other thing is, again, having that correct KPI. Even if you're testing subject lines, your KPI should be conversions or revenue based, not based on open rates, because that doesn't really matter. The other thing about testing is you never know where the ideas are going to come from. So you always have to kind of be open to it. We have a Barnes & Noble here in Georgetown. I went and grabbed a tea and sat down. I used to go on the weekends, and I happened to pick up a book about the psychology of color. And it talked all about how red could psychologically stop people from taking action, stop signs and stoplights. And it gave me an idea because I had a client where their brand colors were red and a really dark purple. And so all of our call to action buttons were red. Add to that the fact that they were a newsletter that told you what stocks to buy, financial advisory. Well, in the red financially is a really bad thing.
Correct.
So basically I went back to that office that Monday and I was like, I'm going to test this. And I was like, I'm going to test green because green is the color of money and we're telling them they can make money. Green is the color of go. And we saw a lift in performance. So you always have to be kind of open to ideas. The other place I think is great to get ideas is just to read what's out there. I have a lot of case studies on my website. And the point of my case studies that I've done with my clients isn't you should do this too, but it's test this with your lists, test this with your program and see if it works. So just reading what other people are doing, which is a big part about how we got this industry started. I mean, I would go to the office and read, at that point, Clixy was the big email publication every morning, and see what other people were doing and what they were testing. And then I would try some of that. And then it was lovely because they asked me to start writing for them. And so that's really how this industry grew and how we built the standards and best practices that we have now in email marketing. So reading what's out there, I think, is really critical. And I feel badly sometimes. I work with a lot of companies where people, they're testing things that we proved didn't work 20 years ago. And so not that you shouldn't try it, but you just don't want to get stuck and you don't want to recreate the wheel.
You're listening to Digital Marketing Domination. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. For more than 30 years, J&L has been driving automotive dealerships to success. Our roots run deep in the automotive industry, giving us an unmatched competitive edge. With over 1,000 satisfied clients harnessing our industry-leading technology, we are your go-to experts in direct and digital marketing. Partner with J&L and drive your dealership forward. J&L Marketing, where experience meets innovation.
So, one of the challenge too is the list size. Not having a big enough list size to test, and that's what I mean by you try to overly test a small, what would you say would be a benchmark for a list size to be able to perform a test?
So my rule is 20,000 per cell. So you would really need to have a list of at least 40,000 to do any testing. Now, that said, when I work with B2B companies, that's often a problem, especially if it's a very niche market. So what we'll do is we'll choose something that we can test over a number of sends. Probably the most obvious would be layout. because even though the copy and the images change, you can use the same layout over and over again. And then what you do is you basically aggregate the results to see if you've got statistically significant results. The other thing you can do like that is, for instance, with subject lines, you can test subject line formulas. So rather than a specific subject line, you test a formula for that subject line. Like, let's make the subject line let's say it's a newsletter. The subject line will be the title of the first article or the topic of the first article. The pre-header text will be the topic of the third article. And then as the headline, we'll use the topic of the fifth article. And then once you figure out what works, you can just do it over and over again. So there's a couple ways to do it. I think it's important. The other thing is you got to take your learnings. I worked with one of the groups at the World Bank, and every time they sent their newsletter, they did a pre-test to test the subject line. And the one subject line was today's date newsletter, and the other subject line was like the title of the first article. And they've been doing this test every day for years. And I kind of showed them that the date never wins. So we can stop testing this and we can move on to test something else.
I think another challenge too is a lot of businesses, they'll run a test, but they're running 2 to 3 tests at once. So you can never get down to a single variable. Was it the headline that moved the needle, or was it the body copy that you did? You got to be able to take a test. You got to have enough data. But then number 2 is it's got to be one single variable that you're testing at a time. What's your strategy to keep track of all the tests in terms of the data? How do you aggregate all that?
I am very old-fashioned. I use an Excel spreadsheet.
Okay.
So we have a plan of what we're going to do. We have descriptions of what the tests are. I have a template that I use with clients. And then we have all of the raw data, which automatically calculates, and then we get our lift loss. So it's a really old-fashioned way to do it, but I haven't really seen a better way. And it helps me because then when you're looking back, you can kind of figure out what worked, and it gives you ideas. So yeah, old-fashioned, but it works.
Yeah, I mean, we've had success like utilizing Power BI to kind of aggregate all the data and be able to pull in some good data analysis to go back a couple of years. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, as long as you're tracking it and keep track of it, that's all that matters. Let's talk a little bit about when you perform an A/B test. You know, there's a lot of different engines out there for email, and we won't get into specifics of who's good and who's not. But how do you?
They're all good. It's like cars, right? Like there's not one that's best for everyone.
Potentially.
It just depends on your needs.
Potentially. There might be a few bad cars out there. When you're performing an A/B test, talk to the audience. How do you set it up? What are the steps to set it up? A successful A/B test.
One thing we don't do is we don't use for the most part, we don't use the built-in testing capability for a couple reasons. One is, back in the day, we had this thing that was like a best practice, like I just talked about with the World Bank, where you would send your test cells in the morning, and then you would see what the results were, and you would send the winner to the rest of the list. And first of all, that only works if you have a really big list, which a lot of my clients did. But secondly, most of the tools that were set up to do that kind of testing use open rate or click-through rate as the KPI. And that's all they can do, because typically the conversion of the revenue number happens on the website. It's outside their immediate environment. It involves an integration. So a lot of those testing tools that are built into the marketing automation platforms are really just useless, and you shouldn't really use them. So the way we do it is we literally just set up, 2 different emails. It's like 2 different sends, but they go at the same time. We split the list in half randomly, which is really, really important. You never want to do like new names versus old names, because new names are always going to perform better. So random split is really important. Making sure you send them at the same time is really important. And then you usually, for a revenue or a conversion, you usually need to wait a few days to really get good results. I mean, I'm kind of type A, so I'll start looking immediately, and 24 hours in, I'll do a preliminary report to the client. But 3 or 4 days later, things can change, especially in a situation where in B2B, they need to get approval from someone, budget approval. They need to get a PO or something. Even in the consumer world, oftentimes people need to check with a spouse or a partner, or they need to check their calendar, so they may not act on it right away.
One of the things that a lot of businesses come to me is they say, hey, at what point do I need to have an IP address for my email sends versus utilizing a variable IP address? Do you have a quantity in mind, a cadence of how many emails they send out, or a total quantity that it makes more sense to have their own IP?
So the key to having your own IP address rather than sharing an IP with someone else is the quantity of your sends and your sender reputation. For some companies, it makes sense, but you really have to be a big volume sender. If you're a low volume sender and you're on your own IP address, you're not going to have enough to get on the radar of those, reputation services. Honestly, in this day and age, and this has kind of changed, most people are fine on a shared IP. The legitimate marketing platforms out there now are familiar with the IP situation. They're really good at kind of what's the word? Kind of balancing their IPs. I have friends who do this, and basically they want to make sure every IP address has at least a 51% positive reputation, and they literally will move sends and senders around to make sure they manage that properly. So in the old days, if you were on an IP with a bad sender, you could get tainted by that. But most of the platforms do a good job right now. And so, unless you're a super big company, it really doesn't make sense to even think about a dedicated IP address. It's expensive. And there's a lot of issues that come with that. So
What would be the amount of sends per month that it would make sense for a dedicated IP?
it's more of a deliverability question. So I don't really have a number for you. Again, it also depends on your reputation. If you're a big quantity sender, but your reputation's terrible, you're much better on a shared IP. So it much more goes with your reputation. If you have a great email sender reputation, you could probably go on a dedicated IP. But unless you had super stellar sender reputation, you really wouldn't want to do that.
Okay. What about email validation? Do you recommend that agencies and/or businesses do some type of email validation? I know with us, we use a couple of email validation tools out there before we send out the emails.
Yeah. First of all, it's important to go opt-in. So
Mhm.
just by going opt-in, you're going to have less of a critical need for the validation tool, but it's still a good idea. I like the tools that check the email address right at the opt-in to make sure that it's good. I think in general, it's good to clean your list at least like once a year. It's also important to go with a reputable vendor for that. There's a bunch of people I know in the industry that do that kind of work, but there's also a bunch of bad players where they'll take your list, they'll send you back a report, but then they'll take your list and sell it to other folks. So it's really important to go with legitimate folks. And it is a good thing to do. With most of the companies I deal with, it's not really a big issue because they're 100% opt in and they're really legitimate companies and they're good about handling bounces and spam complaints and things like that. But, it's still a good thing to do. And especially if you're not opt in, it's absolutely critical to protect your reputation.
You're listening to Digital Marketing Domination. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. Are you tired of generic marketing strategies that don't deliver results? At J&L Marketing, we're not your average agency. Our unique approach and deep data insights set us apart. With a 92% client retention rate and a focus on personalized campaign management, we're here to provide your business with the advantage it deserves. Visit jnlmarketing.com to learn more about our industry-leading digital marketing services.
So for the listeners, basically what an email validation is you're taking your list, you're uploading it in terms of a file, and they're basically saying, hey, here are known bad email addresses. These are spam blocks. These are known bounces. And then you're removing that list to hopefully help out with your deliverability. But we all know that over 4 or 5 years, those emails go bad. So having an ability to be able to keep a track with that, especially if you haven't sent emails out recently, I think it's really, really important.
Yeah, and the thing is bounce management can handle a lot of that too because, basically if you get one hard bounce, you should remove them from your list. If you get soft bounces over 3 consecutive sends. So bounce management is really critical to that. I think the big place where validation can come in is honeypots, which are addresses that are out there on the internet. And if you're not going opt-in, you could get some of those on your list. There's also something one of the groups calls screamers, which are people who are just highly likely to report you as spam if they get tired of your email, which I love that term, screamers. So those are good people to kind of watch out for. But yeah, it's a good thing to do. But again, if you're opt-in, it's less of an issue. And as far as email addresses going bad, typically you'll see those with bounces.
So in a lot of B2C industries, there's a lot of companies out there that do prospect emailing or conquest emailing is what we call it in the automotive industry. And there's some big concerns with that. So people that you've never done business with, they never ever gave you their emails. Talk to me a little bit about some of the risk, and is it something that you do support in some industries?
So we call it cold email where I come from. And I just attended a conference where there was a whole session on cold email. It's just a large business risk for your company. And so you need to determine if it makes sense to do that. One that comes to mind is actually it was a nonprofit, and they had a group of lists that were opt-in, and they had a list that was not opt-in. And we actually were sending the same to both groups. And we found that the group that was opt-in performed 15 times better with regard to conversion. And it wasn't a revenue-based conversion. We just needed them to vote on something. So the thing about cold email is it tends to have a much lower conversion rate and a much higher risk for spam complaints. And you need to figure out if that makes sense for your industry. So I don't work with I don't work with anyone who has 100% cold email program. Like I said, I work with a couple of people who have, you know, cold as well as opt-in, but that's really the concern. And the thing I tell people is, it's kind of like you're saying, well, I want to make sure that I never break a bone. And you're like, okay, but I'm going to jump out of a plane every single day for the next 10 years. And I have a parachute and I'm going tandem and they have a parachute. And there's pillows on the grounds and there's this and there's that. And you're like, okay, so you're doing everything you can. But the point is, if you really don't want to get blocked or you don't want to break a bone, stop jumping out of the plane. Do you know what I mean? So I think, in some cases people are like, oh, we have to. I always try to find a way that we can get people to opt in. And there's ways to do that. One is to go through third-party list rentals where someone sends on your behalf and then those people opt in. Typically, you've got some value proposition for them. Some people call it a lead magnet. So, I'm not a fan of cold email. For me, I just find the risks are too high and the payback is too low. If you feel like you need to do it, that's fine. But there's better ways to do it with lower risk and more upside, but you need to be a little creative about it.
Yeah, my rule of thumb is if you're going to do it, make sure it doesn't go from your system in your IP. Because at the end of the day, you're buying the data, you're renting the data from somebody, have them send it out, but then make
Well,
sure
that would be a third-party list rental, and that would be absolutely okay. It's just if they turn the email addresses over to you, then you need to get a dedicated IP for that.
Correct. Or use a different system, but just make sure it's not attached to your opt-in customers. Because we've seen a lot of customers that they'll buy or they'll rent that list and they'll send it out. And then moving forward, it kills their deliverability.
And, it's also really important if you've got an email marketing program and you have internal people sending email, which pretty much everybody does, right?
Mhm.
You want to have that email marketing program on a separate IP address, because what you don't want to have happen is if something goes wrong there and that gets blacklisted, everything sent from that IP will be blocked, even your internal communications to vendors or customer support or whatever. So yeah, it's always really important to separate those two streams.
A lot of people, when they do email marketing, they rely on whatever email platform to give them the results. Let's dive into a little bit about AI.
Sure.
A lot of agencies and a lot of businesses are using AI to help them write their emails, create them up with testing plans, kind of talk about what's worked and what hasn't worked.
Yeah, I use AI a lot with my clients. I was actually an early adopter, and I do a lot of training on AI. I did a couple workshops in person in June at Email Innovations World, and then I'm doing some online training. AI is another tool, and I feel like a lot of people are misusing it. The way I've found the best way to use AI is to do something that you can do without it, but work with AI to create a custom GPT that makes it faster for you to do it with AI. It's important to make it something that you can do on your own, because that's the only way that you know the quality you're looking for that you need to have. And then training the custom GPT, that can just help you do it faster. But I really treat the custom GPTs as I micromanage them. It's like they're really smart interns, but you wouldn't say to an intern, hey, go create this email. So you say to the intern, hey, let's look at the marketing foundations. Let's figure out our features, benefits, advantages. Let's come up with our key messages. And I do each of those step by step with the GPTs. And then, hey, okay, we've got all this. Let's create a creative brief and let's give that to the copywriter. There's some things that AI can do that are harder to do in the real world, and AI makes it easy. And one of the biggest ones that I thought was like a party trick when I first heard about it, but then I found it really useful, is creating a target audience persona AI. So that's something I do for all my clients. We make it really detailed. We have, the marketing foundations, all the target audience demographics. And then when we get that first features, benefits, advantages, we run it past the target audience persona and have it give us feedback. Is this spot on? What are we missing? And then we do that with all the marketing copy too. So the two ways to use AI are, one, use it to do what you would do more quickly, but again, you have to micromanage it. But then the other is getting this, third party feedback, which, you can do in the real world. And I've done it by calling people and saying, hey, would you look at this because you're my target audience? But the AI can do it much more quickly. I think, people are using AI in too simplistic a way, and a lot of times the output is garbage, and you need not to do that. That's not good.
So help out the audience a little bit, because you brought up custom GPT, and I assume you're talking about Chat GPT. How
Yeah.
do you go about creating a custom GPT? What are the steps to do that?
It's really not as hard as people think. The key is figuring out what you want that GPT to do, because I have a team of GPTs. I have a marketing strategist and a copywriter, and I have a data GPT. And so you figure out what you need it to do. And then the place I like to start is just as I would start as if I were hiring someone. I'll go on LinkedIn and I'll find some job descriptions. And so I'll start there and create a job description for the GPT. What do I want it to do? And actually create that job description. And then I figure out what does it need to do the job well. So for instance, with a copywriter, one of the big things that it needs is it needs samples that have the tone and voice of the client we're writing for. A simple way to get that is to give it a link to the website or a blog if they have one, because it can go and ingest all that. The other thing you can do is upload copy from existing emails. And I think that's really important. And that's a step a lot of people miss, because that copywriter needs to have the tone and voice of the brand that you're dealing with. And so that is really important. So the whole idea is, defining what you need it to do and then giving it the resources it needs to do it well. My data GPT, I actually gave it a spreadsheet that had all of the email marketing formulas that I use, as well as an example with a data set of how to calculate them. And now I can upload a spreadsheet and it can give me those things lickety split. Could I still do it myself? I totally could, but could I do it in 30 seconds? No. So that's where I really find ChatGPT can save time.
So when you talk about the GPTs, are you talking specifically going in and clicking new chat and then creating basically that profile? And then when you go to ask it to do any of that work, you go back to that chat, or are you doing that in the projects?
No, I actually create custom GPTs. So if you click on the button that gives you a list of, I think it's called GPTs, then there's like a plus sign or something that lets you create a new one. And I actually create a new GPT. So for each of my clients, I have so many GPTs that I've created now, because you'll have a couple target audience GPTs. I have copywriters for each of my clients. So we're actually creating individual GPTs. So you don't have to go back to the original chat, because you just go to the GPT and then all of that information is baked in. So all that thing with prompt engineering about you're a world famous email marketing expert, you know how to do this and you know how to do that. You don't have to do that every time, because the GPT, that's what's built into the configuration.
Awesome. Very good information. So you have a GPT for each different workflow?
So I have, basically it's like you would do in a company. So I have GPTs with different skill sets.
Different team members. Okay.
Yeah. So, and the great part is, you can bring multiple GPTs together into a single discussion, which is really where it gets fun. So that's one of the things I teach in my advanced class. But yeah, so I would say the basic ones I have is I have a strategist, I have a copywriter, and I have a target audience persona. Those are the ones that I train people on. I have a data analyst. What else do I have? I have a whole bunch, and it depends on kind of what we need for the client.
What are some small details that you see have made the biggest difference when customers are doing email marketing?
Curiosity. You need someone who's really into it, maybe a little bit of a competitive nature, which I know I myself have, because what you need in an email marketing person, it doesn't matter whether they're a junior person or they're more senior, is you need someone who has a curiosity and they want to always do better. It's not really about getting the send out on time. Oh, I need to get the send out. I need to get the send out. It's about what the content of that email is. someone who is curious about what might work better, someone who, reads and sees what other people are doing. I think really that's the most important thing. And I think that's why so many email marketing programs really lag. I mean, it's amazing to me when I go into a new client, and it's a brand name company, and you start looking at the email and there's so many things we can do to make it better. So I think that's really the key. You need to have someone in that role who really cares and wants to improve performance.
Where do you feel like the future of email marketing is going?
I think the future is bright. I mean, I've been on so many panels about how email is dead and RSS is going to take over and social media is going to take over. But I think the future is bright. I think it's still going to be uh, a key channel. Really, if you think about it, email is very special because on social media, the audience is actually owned by the platform. A great example of that is, Twitter. When a lot of people left Twitter a few years ago because they were unhappy, people who had a lot of following on Twitter had no way to reach out and connect with those people elsewhere. With email, you actually own the relationship. You've got their email address. And if they have a relationship with you and they like your content, if they change companies, if you have a business address, they'll give you their new business address because they want to stay in touch. That's another key factor that I think a lot of us are missing is it allows for a lot more personalization than, say, a social media channel because it is one-to-one communications. And we have to honor that and we have to use that wisely. I think that, one thing that we've seen is, false positives on, spam block lists are much less frequent than they used to be. And I think we're moving in the right direction on that. I think the spam problem will probably be resolved in the next 10 years, which I think is really a good thing. So I think it's really got a bright future. It's really unique. I mean, there aren't a lot of other channels that are one-to-one. You've got telephone, but that's very expensive. You've got direct mail, but it's not dead, it's coming back, but that's also very expensive. So that's where email has this sweet spot. It's one-to-one, you own the relationship, and it's more cost effective. So it's not going anywhere.
Well, I think you gave our listeners some great information. I appreciate you being on.
Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me.
So that wraps up another episode of Digital Marketing Domination. A big thank you to Jeanne for sharing her time and experience with us. Remember, you can catch all of our episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, and iHeartRadio. If you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave us a review. Thanks for listening.